Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Julio Godinez, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar, Addressing Security Debt with a Developer First Approach, brought to you by WhiteSource. We have a great webinar for you today, but before we get started, I need to go through some housekeeping announcements. Today's event is being recorded, so if you missed any part of the webinar, you will be able to watch it again. We will be sending out a link to access the webinar on demand, or you can visit securityboulevard.com/webinars, and it will be available to you as well. Finally, stick around at the end because we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stay tuned to see if you're a winner. Joining me today is Shiri Arad Ibtsan, Director of Product, White Source, and I'm now going to put myself on mute, turn off my camera, and let you get to it.
Thank you so much, Julio, for the introduction. So we do have a great webinar today, I believe. Very important content, both for the security people here, but also for the developers. And this webinar actually has two main parts. So addressing a security debt with a developer first approach. We are first going to speak about this security debt, right? Why do we have it? What is it? What kind of security issues and application security problems and challenges organizations are facing these days? And then on the second part, we are going to understand this developer first approach. I mean, we are hearing that security is moving, the awareness for security is moving to the developers. Do developers need to own the security? Who needs to own the security in the organization? And what is the part of the developers? So I'm sure that a lot of these questions don't have one answer, right? It depends on the organization, it depends on the people a lot of the times, and on the culture in the organization. But we are going to touch upon various points that are probably right for any organizations. We're going to talk about, again, what kind of security issues we see across organizations. We are going to discuss how important it is to have a champion on the development side to be aware of the security and to lead the process of security. So let's start. And first, we are going to tackle the question of security, or why are applications more vulnerable to attacks? And this is a very important question because eventually security is getting more and more problematic and more challenging for organizations, right? 10 years ago, we may have been here in a similar webinar, but we wouldn't have a lot of the things and a lot of the challenges that we have today. So first of all, 10 years ago, we didn't have as many applications and as many critical and business critical applications as we have today, right? So it's not a secret. We have the digital transformation. We are all aware that the world is now driven by machines, driven by code, right? Almost everything. So starts from like, our groceries to anything almost that we have, to the cars, right? So things are getting more and more digitalized, and therefore we have more critical, business critical applications to run. And we understand that hackers also see that. And the first reasons that applications are more vulnerable is that we have more application. But the second one is that everything is a lot more business critical. So we are relying on the first part of this webinar on a research done by Ponemon Research Institute. And this research actually examined many applications, right? More than 2,000 business applications that were deployed within various organizations. And in this specific research, around 30 of them were considered business critical. And we are going to see and tackle all kinds of applications and all kinds of challenges within these applications. So yeah, we have more applications, we have more software deployed, But it's not the only thing, right? We also want this code to be deployed a lot faster. So the next thing, other than the digital transformation, or in addition to that, is that the software world is being driven a lot faster than before, right? So if a few years back we were all running in waterfall methods, and we had an application, and it took us around a year or maybe 6 months to develop, and then to test, and then to release, and everything was on-prem, right? Almost nothing was SaaS. So almost nothing was deployed on the cloud. And all of these different things actually led us to a point where security really can't keep up with how fast the software development world is running. Because security is sort of still all processes. We still need to make sure that everything is secure. We cannot rush it, right? It's not unlike open source, right? Open source led us to become a lot more agile, because now we can rely on code that other people wrote. We don't have the same thing in security, or we do, but it's a little different. So those are two different drivers that are actually leading us to a point where security is a lot more important and a lot more challenging to organizations than before. Moving on to the next slide. So in this specific research, we compared, or the research compared, between applications back 6 years ago, right? Back in 2015 to 2020. So that was last year. And they actually compared between those two, the same organizations, 5 years apart. And we try to understand, are we getting better or are we getting worse in handling security? And actually, there are some good news, right? On a positive note, more organizations are making the protection of applications a top priority and a top objective in the organization. So it's not only that it's a greater challenge and it's a bigger issue, they are also putting the resources in it. So we can see that it's not in this slide, but definitely we can see that there is a lot more awareness and a lot more budget for security today than 5 years ago. And now we want to understand from what kind of attacks our organization most concerned about. And here you can see, so the blue line would be what was defined in the research as high-performing organizations. The ones who had very good mitigations of security, they had good security tools implemented, and the yellow bar would be just the overall, so like the average. And we can see that the thing that concerns us the most by far is hacks to insecure applications. So we do know that in our organization, we have some applications that are insecure or that are less protected than other applications. And these are the ones that concern organization the most. And this is probably where they would put a lot of effort in trying to secure these applications. So we can see from our customers, our users, that a lot of the time those are legacy applications. So things that are harder to maintain, both in terms of the functionality, but also in terms of security. The other thing that we can see on the other end is trying to secure new kind of technologies, right? Trying to secure containers, trying to secure serverless. And these applications would often be insecure as well, just because there is lack of knowledge. So in both cases, there is like sort of lack of knowledge. In the first, because there is just it's legacy. We don't know how to maintain it. And on the other hand, we have, new technologies, again, not sure how to maintain it. But this is definitely the highest concern. We can see hacks at the network layer. And by the way, this was the leading one, I think, in 2015. So that's something that, again, is still a concern, and we will see in one of the next slides that this is something that organizations waste a lot of budget for. So securing the network layer, so that would be like firewalls, making sure that the everything is encrypted in terms of the network, etc. And hacks through insecure devices is also another very important thing. Again, we're moving with COVID, move to work from home. Some employees of the organizations may have devices that are insecure or networks that are not secure, etc. And we have hacks through website and insecure operating system, which is another concern. But so far, we can see that we can focus on insecure applications and the network layer, more or less. This is what we're going to focus on. And now to the next slide, and this is something that is very important, right? This is exactly what I mentioned before. So we can see that, again, applications and network are the things that are most important, right? If we're being just based on the previous slide, these are the things that concern the organization the most. We understand that it's most important to protect those. So if we look at this chart, we can actually see the level of risk, right? So that would be an objective level of risk versus the amount of money that is spent on that specific part. And we can definitely see that even though the level of risk in the application part is a lot more than the network, we can still see that there is a lot more money wasted on actually protecting the network. And a very important question is, why would that be, right? Why is there more money spent on network security than application security if we understand both from the objective data and from the fact that this is the thing that concerns most companies? So we can think of various reasons, right? There is no one specific reason, but if we need to look at it, I definitely think that those are historical reasons, right? There is a dedicated budget for network security, right? Everyone knows that you need a firewall and that you need the data to be encrypted and that you need all kinds of tests to make sure that this is happening, right? Like penetration tests. Application security, you know that you need to invest resources in it, but you're not fully sure what this is. Another important thing, and I think we will touch it in one of the next slides, is that application security has a lot of parts in it, right? It's proprietary code, right? Making sure that what your developers, the code that they are writing is actually secure and that there are no vulnerabilities in it. But it's also the third-party code, right? So maybe you purchased a subscription or a commercial software. We need to make sure that that is secure as well. We need to make sure that, again, any technology that you put, like containers, Kubernetes, serverless functions, those are secure. This is also considered as application security. And of course, open source, right? Around 70 to 80% of the code that organizations are using is comprised of open source. And how do you even protect that? So I think that one of the reasons is, again, lack of awareness and the complexity of that. Also, new technologies, so like, infrastructure as code and API security, all of those sort of get under the application security umbrella, and that's quite a lot to cover. But again, network security is the thing that most organizations spend most of the money on. So this is a very important note, and you definitely need to go to your organization and see what the budget looks like, right? Do I invest enough in protecting my application? Do I invest maybe some budget that is not that important in protecting the network layer? And of course, both are super important. And also the things that we didn't discuss, like endpoint security and data security and the server and operating system security, those are also very, very important. I'm just focusing on just a few. Okay, so almost half of the organizations, and this is a very interesting fact, that almost half of the organizations that were surveyed have a formal or, and sorry, half of the organization didn't have a formal approach. They had like no approach at all or a very ad hoc approach to security. And we can see the data back from 2015, right, where it was a lot more problematic. Almost everyone like didn't have any formal. They had like informal information of how we should protect the software security development lifecycle. By the way, the initials here, SSDLC, stand for Secure Software Development Lifecycle. And the question that the research asked them is, what best describes the software security development lifecycle in your organization? And there were various answers, but only 19% was yes, there is a formal approach, there is a formal structure. I know exactly what I need to do. It's not like improvising. That was only 19%. That was back in 2015. And when we look at last year, right, 2020, we see that it's almost, I wouldn't say it's doubled, but it's a lot more. It's 33%, which is a very important number. So we understand that during those 5 years, organizations actually took the security challenge very seriously, right? So they now, if before that they didn't really have a process, now a lot more of them actually have a formal process. And if there is a new open source component that I want to add in the organization, I need to first go ahead and check if it has any security issue. And before releasing a version to production, I need to make sure that it's being scanned in the CI/CD. So there are various tools that can help you with it, but without the awareness, there is almost nothing you can do. Still, we can see, as the title here says, that a lot of organizations don't actually have a process for securing the life cycle. So that means that application security is remain maybe in the hands of the developers, maybe in the hands of the security person, maybe it's the DevOps who is responsible for supply chain security. So it's really like there is no official approach. So this is very, very important, and we need to keep that in mind when we think of processes around security, because it's really hard to of course we all know organizations in general, and we know that it's very hard to add new formal new approaches, whether if it's security or if it's anything else. So in my organization, for example, we tried to put the OKR, right, objectives and key results process. This was very challenging, right? Making sure that you have a new cultural change, even just a process change, is very hard for organizations and people within organizations to consume. So this is why we need to be very delicate, and I will try by the end of this webinar to give you some tools on how to do that effectively within your organization. So the next thing is that this is more of the second part, where we understood why security is an issue. We understand how security is important and how it's a challenge to the organization. But now let's look at the development organization, or the R&D. And we specifically would want to look at the collaboration between security teams and the development teams. because that collaboration and that cooperation is super important to making sure that the security of your applications is working as expected, right? At the end of the day, we can have security people and they can have very good, compliance and policies, but at the end of the day, the developers need to be on board. They need to have buy-in in order to make sure that they actually solve the issues, they remediate the issues, they don't just ignore security as part of the development. So that collaboration is super important to making sure that this process is successful. And when we asked organizations about the collaboration between the teams, this is, by the way, a very sad number. 86% of the respondents actually state that there is only some or no collaboration at all between teams. So for me, again, this is something a challenge that I face almost every day. Because when we speak to users, when we speak to customers, we want to make sure that implementing the security mechanisms will actually be a success, right? We want to make sure that once you implement a security process, you look after 2 or 3 months and you see that you have less security issues. But if there is no collaboration, we can have all the best tools in the world, but eventually nothing will be solved and nothing will be remediated. So looking at this limited connection between development and security teams, and basically what I ask myself is, how can we make it better? What can we do within our organizations to make it better? And I think it's definitely a challenge in all organizations, but in enterprise, very large organizations, it's even more of a challenge. We need the organization to actually establish a formal structure, a formal approach to security, and we need all the different departments within the organization to be on board, to have the same process or more or less the same process. So the next slide is exactly about how we do that. So how we address vulnerabilities in enterprise applications or enterprise organizations. And here we definitely understand, and I think that all or most of the larger enterprise today understand that they need to establish some sort of formal structure, whether if it's a security team, DevSecOps, or a developer within each R&D department that is responsible for the security, and we'll see some of the possible structures here. But this is really the making sure that security is integrated in the pipeline or in the life cycle. This is our way to make sure that, again, it's really that you're really treating security as part of the development. We started a presentation with speaking about the fact that the world is getting more and more agile. We have, the software life cycle is just moving a lot faster. And my sort of first tip here would be to make sure that you adapt or you add and integrate the security into existing processes within the organization. So it's not just taking the security and then teaching the security teams about the new technologies and teaching developers about, the top security concerns and how to resolve them. That would not be enough. You need to have the processes in place. So that would mean that the developer needs to know exactly in which point as part of coding or as part of development, they review the security. So for example, a good example would be the code review process, right? Each developer would probably have a process of code review where they sit with a colleague or with their direct manager and review the code that they wrote to make sure that it's built correctly in terms of the the structure, that there are no functional bugs, maybe other architectural concerns that they need to address. And the developer also needs to know that this is when the team leader or the colleague will review the security part. So making sure that your code is actually secure. Another example would be the design step, right? So there is maybe a software architect or a tech lead that is doing the architecture for a specific application or a specific feature. We need to add a section of security to make sure that all the protocols, all the data, all the applications are secure. And we need to make sure that we have this process in each and every step of our software development lifecycle. And I think this is super critical to the success of this whole process. So moving on to the next slide, and this is something that we really want to be able to answer. So how do developer fit into the SSDLC? And again, it's pretty obvious that if it's a software development lifecycle, the developers are there. So the question is mostly around security. So how do developers fit in the security part in the development lifecycle? What is their role in it? Are they fully responsible for it? If there is a security issue, who do we blame? Do we blame the developer? Do we blame the security person? Do we blame the software architect? Do we blame the product manager? And it's not really a question of, who do we blame? It's more of a question of who is responsible and to what extent am I responsible for the code that I am writing. And this is, of course, a question that doesn't have like one specific answer, and any organization can find their right answer. But it's really important to know what is the data. And we see that both security professionals and developers say that they would sacrifice security for speed. And this is, by the way, again, it's not a good thing, right? We understand that speed is important and the business needs are sort of critical, and we need to understand and always be aware of the business need. But it's also very dangerous to sort of sacrifice security to meet your development, and your deployment cycles. And I would expect this answer from developers sometimes, as if I'm a developer, I really want to make sure that I have my deadlines, I develop something, I want to move on to my next feature. So that would be sort of expected sometimes. But for security persons, security professionals, this is a little bit different. And I think this is the cause of the gap or the lack of collaboration that we usually see between security and developers. And once we have one goal, right, we all know that, we don't want to sacrifice security for speed, or we are okay with sometimes in some sort of circumstances, policies, we are okay with sacrificing security for speed. So that would be like making this one specific goal for the entire organization and making sure that we actually comply with it. So I think that the second tip maybe that derives from this specific slide or from this entire topic is making sure that you have your organizational policy, right? And maybe it's not an organizational policy, maybe it's a policy for each department or even a policy for each application. So for example, in this application, I'm okay with high severity security vulnerability because it's not a business critical one. It's an internal application. It's not something that I need to really, really secure. It doesn't have any sensitive data. But on another application, I cannot even stand, even if I have low severity security vulnerability, I'm not going to be okay with it and I'm not going to release it to production. So this kind of policy makes sure that we can actually navigate our way and make sure that we do have both speed but also secure pipelines, which is the most important thing. So there may be sometimes a need to compromise on security. If you are okay with it and you've done all of your research and you know the price that you are may will maybe pay, if there is an issue, then that's definitely fine, right? It's not a matter of, security is the most important thing and we will never compromise on security. The next thing is the battle, and you can see that the visuals here for the battle. So security and developers. And I think that, again, it's really important for both security and developer professionals to be aligned on the features that are needed for developer adoption, because we understood that eventually application security is all about their collaboration with developers and making sure that you have the R&D organizations buy-in and they are part of this process. And the most important thing is to actually make sure that the developers can work with a specific tool, right? So that the tool is actually easy for them, both to integrate but also to use. I think this is the main takeaway from this slide, right? It's like the most important thing for both security and not really developers, but for security people is the ease of integration, right? If the tool is hard to integrate, I have nothing to do with it because I'm just not going to make it. There are so many things to prioritize between. And if the tool is hard to integrate, it's not going to work. The thing that is most important for developers, and this is actually not very surprising, is the accuracy. So it's well known that some security tools would have false positives, right? They would detect something that is supposedly a vulnerability, but in fact, it's not really a vulnerability. And for developers, their most important asset is their time, right? If they have time, they can develop, they can add new things, that it can add new capabilities. So they don't like wasting time. And also they really don't like working on things that don't really matter, that don't really have an effect. So this is the most important thing for them. I would add to accuracy also the prioritization part, which is something that we are going to discuss in a few slides. So it's both making sure that the tool is accurate, but it's also making sure that I'm actually working on the things that matter the most for the organization or the things that are most business critical for the organization. So this is also a very important aspect. What tool do you choose, right? What feature is the most important when it comes to the developer's adoption? So the next point would be, I want the tool to be easy to use. I want to make sure that it's not something that I need to have like very long training or I need to waste my time. Again, it's all about wasting time. It's all about making sure that I don't waste my time and resources. Another important thing about wasting time is that you, as security and developers and maybe other people within organizations, know that the crisis or the challenge today is to find developers, and finding good developers is definitely a challenge within the industry in general. So we really need to make sure that we have tools that are easy to use, easy to integrate, and that we don't waste time based on them. The next point would be there's a but to it, right? So security professionals, they usually are the ones who actually choose the tool, and they would maybe sometimes put other things in priority. They are not actually the developer's adoption. So here in the slide, we can see that the question was, when you consider or when you choose the application security tools, which of the following are most important to you? And you needed to basically prioritize them between 1 and 7. And here we can see a very sad fact that number 6 is developer adoption. I definitely think that this trend is changing, right? I think that nowadays developers have more, I would say, they care more about the security tools, and also the security people would take them into account more when choosing a security tool. But we can see here various things that security professionals would prioritize over developer adoption, or the ease of use, right, would be one of them, but also early detection, right? I want to make sure that this tool detects the vulnerabilities as early as possible, how easy it is for me as a security person to implement. Does it have, what is the coverage, right? Does it have a coverage for the full path that I need? Is it compatible with my existing stack? And is it easy to use? So there are various other things other than developer adoption that security people would definitely prioritize. And again, I definitely think that this trend is changing, and the developer adoption is now becoming like maybe 3 or 4, and it's getting there. But we definitely understand, like, for example, if you are security professionals, this is probably the most important parameter to the success of the tool, right? Is the tool going to be a success or a failure if it's an application security tool? It's mostly driven by, are developers going to use it? Are developers going to fix vulnerabilities based on the results? So developers' adoption is definitely critical for that. The next slide is more about, the result. And we can see that companies are actually wasting a lot of budget investing in application security tools that don't really fit their needs, because they are just simply not being used by developers. And we can see here, so we discussed before, there are various types of application security, right? The proprietary code. So that would be mostly SAS, static application security testing, DAST, dynamic application security testing, and IAST, interactive application security testing. They are all used mostly to protect the proprietary code, right? So mostly to protect the code that your developers are writing within the organization, whereas we have SCA. So SCA is software composition analysis, and this is all about open source security. How do I secure my open source applications? And we can see that basically security are using more than the developers most of the things, right? So they would use both SAST and SCA are being used more by security than by developers. There is I think an issue here with the slide, but basically you can see definitely SAST. So there are various different resources we need to look at when choosing the specific security tool. But I think that the main input is that there are various both knowledge but also skill gaps that are still being neglected by organizations. So when we think of, why wouldn't developers use the security tool, right? Why wouldn't they care about security? So the first answer, of course, is awareness. Maybe they are not being measured. And they are not being evaluated based on handling security issues or detecting security issues. So that would be one thing. And this is the thing I think we touched upon. And this is all about, cultural change and making sure that we have the right processes in place. But once you change it, right? Once the KPI or the goal of a developer is to detect security issues as early as they can and to and to make sure that everyone in the organization is aware of that, and to make sure that they remediate the issues as fast as possible. Once you have that in place, in many organizations, you still have a knowledge gap. So the security teams are probably not aware of all the different technologies and all the different tools that the developers are using. Maybe they are not even familiar with what software languages they're using. And the second thing is that the developers are not security experts, right? They don't have all the knowledge about the security. And they don't need to be, right? We don't want developers to be security experts. We want them to be experts in developing applications. So how do you sort of bridge this gap? How do we make sure that first we have the expertise of each and every one of them, but we also don't have knowledge gaps that make us avoid using the security tools or make us neglect security? So this is another question that we asked our organizations or the users. And we asked, what are the biggest challenges in implementing and running your application security program? And here we can see that this is definitely the skill and maybe the personnel, but also the right skills and knowledge is definitely a very big challenge for them. But there is another challenge that has to do both with tools and with knowledge, which is the prioritization. And the main challenge and the main question that they have is, how do I prioritize, right? I have SAST, I have DAST, I have IAST, I have SCA, I maybe have all kinds of other things that I need to secure and all kinds of other security technologies. And how do I know what should I tackle first? What should I approach first? I have a few high severity vulnerabilities. How do I know which of them I need to prioritize? And this is mostly a process and a knowledge gap, but also it's a matter of finding the right tools that helps you prioritize correctly. And so we see that this is definitely the biggest challenge for them, right? So after they understood they need a security process and they chose the tool, now when implementing the tools, they don't really know how to prioritize vulnerabilities. And we see that most organizations, even though this is the highest challenge and highest concern, they don't have a standardized prioritization process. And once you don't have a process, this definitely leads to friction and to gap between teams, because the security teams says, okay, this is the most important thing we need to tackle, but then the developer says, no, this is not the most important thing. And once you cannot explain and you don't have really a format or a standard for prioritization, this will for sure cause friction and will cause conflicts between different teams. So the other thing, other than prioritization, and prioritization is a very big subject among vulnerabilities and security. But another important thing is the training. And training is both for prioritization, but also for organizational policy. And on basically just how to write secure code, how to choose secure open source components. And we can see that, first of all, we asked, do you have any secure coding training initiatives in your organization? And we can see that there are some independent training, but in most organizations, there is no thing like that. There is no secure code training. So how do we expect developers to be aware of security and to write secure code if they don't have the right knowledge and the right skills, right? We just don't train them for that. And the other thing is that, again, a lot of the organizations, both within security and the development, don't really have that kind of a program. They may receive some sort of, annual training on secure coding, which we know is definitely not enough, right? This needs to be something that we do on a daily basis. Is definitely one annual thing is not enough. So this is a very important aspect, right? If we want developers to be aware of security, we need to make sure that they are trained for it and that they have the right skills and the right knowledge. And the next thing is about the security program. Has it been in place? Is there a formal program in place? And we can definitely see that this is something that is gaining popularity around security teams. We can see that there is an application security program in the organizations, but for the developers, we see that they're not really aware of it. There may have been a security program in place, but they don't really know anything about that. And I think this is definitely one of the reasons. I mean, all of what we just mentioned is the reasons to have an application security champion. This is something that I definitely emphasized in the past. But we see also when we implement white source, but just in general in organizations, once we have a champion that helps, building the skills, doing the prioritization, doing the communication internally and externally within the organizations, we see that the success of the application security program, maintaining and making sure that we have the objectives, all of that is definitely becoming a lot easier when we have a champion. They can be within the security department, they can be within the development in organization or department. But we can see that there is a lot less friction and a lot less, gaps and conflicts once there is a champion that is responsible for maintaining this process. Again, the communication is, I think, one of the biggest challenges when setting such a program, specifically because there are just different interests to different departments within the organization. So this is super important. So if we sort of conclude everything that we just discussed, it's really about having all hands on deck. So it's security, developers, DevOps, practically the entire organization need to make sure that we achieve this DevSecOps maturity. So what have we discussed if we try to summarize? So we started with understanding why security is so important and why do we have more challenge around security in the last few years. Now we saw that the situation in organizations is actually getting better, right? We have more awareness to security across organizations. After that, we discussed what does it take for an organization to have a successful application security program. And we discussed training and prioritization and standards and processes, assigning an AppSec champion and having some sort of automation, shifting left, making sure that you actually detect the vulnerabilities as early as possible. And I think above all, it's definitely communication between the security, the development, the DevOps, to make sure that we have these processes in place and that if we have some sort of conflicts around prioritization or around the standards, we have a way to communicate them. And I definitely think those are some great tips for actually having a successful journey for security, of course, with developers in mind. And so that was all for today. Thank you so much for joining the webinar and see you in the next webinar. Bye-bye.